And so he closes his right eye but keeps his left eye open, and then kind of leans his head on his shoulder, so it made it look like that he fell asleep while he was driving. Hi friends, how are you guys all doing? I am doing great. I am kind of in the chatty mood today, so I'm going to tell you guys some stories. Particularly, these are going to be some of the more crazier / funnier stories when I have taken Uber. So usually I take Uber when I go on trips, or if I'm just running late and I don't feel like taking public transportation. Usually I will take public transportation because
Uber is so expensive.
You know, they really need to lower their prices. And the last thing I need is for my bank account to go down when I'm on a trip. Like, I should be relaxing, not worrying about how I'm spending so much money on these Ubers. You know what I mean? So the first story I'm going to tell you guys is from my most recent trip. This was when I was in Vegas, and this was the last night I was in Vegas. So the next day I was about to leave, and I decided to check out the Wynn Hotel. It was one of the hotels that another Uber driver suggested I check out while I was in the city. And so I was like, you know what? Last night, let's go check out this hotel. So I ordered an Uber, and it took forever for this Uber driver to come because I don't know what he was doing, but it just took him a really long time. So he picks me up, I get into the car in the back, and he asks me if I was staying at the Wynn or the Strat, and I told him I was staying at the Strat Hotel. So we start driving. It's not a very long ride. I think it's only about 10 minutes, but he takes this turn, and we end up in like a dead end, and he's like,
well, this doesn't look like the Wynn.
And I was like,
no, it doesn't.
And in my mind, I'm just thinking like,
where is this man taking me?
Because he's not following the route, so I think he just made a wrong turn. But I was just a little bit concerned for a second because we ended up at a dead end. This next story happened 6 years ago when I was visiting Phoenix, Arizona. So obviously in Phoenix, Arizona, they don't really have public transportation, so I need to order an Uber everywhere I went. And I was ordering an Uber to go back to my hotel, I do remember. And the Uber driver who picked me up, he was very, very open and talkative. So he was telling me about his ex-wife and his life story. And he asked me if I was from Phoenix, and I was like, no, I'm just visiting. And so he's giving me a tour of where everything was. And so he's like, yeah, so over here is like one of the sand dunes that we have. And then over here is the city. And at the same time, talking to me about his ex-wife and his life story. He was very, very chatty, but it's a very interesting ride. I'm just sitting in the back thinking, wow, I'm getting a free tour. The next story is from when I was on a business trip in Houston. This happened in 2022. So I think I was Ubering home from dinner. I believe there was one night I had to Uber to go out to dinner, and then I was Ubering home, and the guy who picked me up was driving so fast. He was going about 80 miles per hour on the highway. And at the same time, he's like watching a basketball game on his phone. Like his phone was like docked, and he was watching a basketball game and going 80 miles per hour on the highway. And I was like,
I really hope we don't get into a collision.
Because I was kind of scared that we were going so fast, and he was half focused on driving, half not focused on driving. This next story happened last year in Palm Springs, and this was a lady who picked me up, and she was also very, very talkative. I feel like a lot of ladies, especially who pick me up in Ubers, are just really talkative. I don't know if it's just like a woman-to-woman bond or something, but anyways, she's talking to me about how she really got started driving Uber and how she had a daughter who was starting a new job, and then she was telling me about her daughter's baby and her daughter's baby daddy, and showing me pictures of her niece and her daughter's husband, and was telling me how she used to have a certain type of car, and she liked driving Uber with that type of car because it saved a lot of gas, but the only downside was that it didn't really have a trunk. So that means anytime she was picking up people who were visiting who had big suitcases, it would be an issue because they couldn't put their suitcase in the trunk. She was very, very talkative, and usually when I get super talkative people like that, I don't really get a chance to talk much because they're talking the whole time. And so I'm just sitting there listening to her life story. About this next Uber ride happened last year in LA, and I was with my mom, and we were Ubering, I think, to the Griffith Observatory to see the Hollywood sign. So my mom calls an Uber, we get in, and it was a fine Uber ride. I remember the guy drove a Tesla, so we were sitting in the back and he was just driving and everything's normal. And then there was a moment where he looked out his right window at something. I'm not sure what he was looking at, and the light on the street turned red, so obviously the car stopped, but he's still looking out his window and driving, and so he doesn't stop till the very last second, and we literally almost rear-ended the car in front of him. Like, if he hit his brakes a second later, we would have gotten into a collision. So I remember when that happened, my mom and I were just like, oh my gosh, like, it was a pretty scary moment. Luckily, we weren't on the highway because I feel like that would have been even worse. This next story also happened in Vegas, and this actually happened the day after I went to the Wynn Hotel where I got into the Uber and the guy took me to like a dead end. This was the next day. I was going to the airport to catch my flight and come home, and the Uber driver that I called kept making wrong turns. He wasn't taking the route that Uber was showing him, and so I'm just like,
why is he missing all these turns?
But anyways, he finally arrives. I get into the car, and then again, he's not following the map that Uber is showing him. He keeps missing turns, and yeah, I don't know what was going on in his mind. We were silent the entire time, so I don't know why he was not going the route that Uber was showing him to go. This next Uber story also happened very recently. This was in Denver, and there was nothing particularly odd about this Uber driver. So it was another woman, and she was telling me how she was born in Denver, but then her family moved to San Antonio for 10 years, and then she went somewhere else for college, but then she eventually made her way back to Denver. So she was telling me how she had been driving these roads in Denver for 20 years, and she was asking me what I was doing here, where I was from, and she was also asking me how old I was. And I mean, that's not a weird question, but that was the first time an Uber driver has ever asked me how old I was. So we had a really good conversation. There was nothing really, really strange besides the fact that she was just telling me her entire life story. And then finally, this last Uber story happened in Vegas, and this was when I was Ubering back from visiting the 7 Magic Mountains. And so this guy picks me up, and he's telling me how when he was coming to pick me up, he knew he was going to 7 Magic Mountains, and then he told me that he didn't really take the route that Uber was telling him to take because it would have taken him a lot longer to get to me. And he was telling me a bunch of things, and I didn't really understand what he was saying because it wasn't very coherent. But then he starts telling me about his life story. So he's talking to me about his daughter and how his wife and him used to live in Florida, and then they moved out to Vegas about 5 years ago. And he's also like joking around with me, and he tells me a story where he once picked up these 4 women, and so 3 of them sat in the back, 1 of them sat in the front. And this obviously isn't my own personal Uber story, but this is just a story that he told me, and it just shows how much of a jokester he is. So he told me that him and the woman sitting in the front are just having a conversation, and the 3 women in the back are having their own conversation. And then he decides to make a joke because apparently he's a jokester, and so he closes his right eye but keeps his left eye open, and then kind of leans his head on his shoulder, so it made it look like that he fell asleep while he was driving. And then when he did that, the 3 women in the back and the woman who was sitting next to him all like touched his shoulder and shaking him, trying to wake him up. And obviously he wasn't sleeping, so then he started laughing when he woke up. And he told me that that was the best / funniest prank he ever played as an Uber driver. All right, you guys, those are my handful of memorable Uber stories. Let me know in the comments down below any memorable Uber stories that you guys have, and also subscribe, turn on the bell notification if you're not subscribed already, and also give this video a thumbs up, and I will talk to you guys next time. Bye.